This is a true horror story about a deeply unsettling real experience that fundamentally shattered my foundational understanding of physical reality, proving that the most terrifying anomalies do not always hide in the pitch-black darkness, but sometimes wait patiently for you in the harsh, bright light of your own bathroom. Most people casually browse the internet late at night looking for a fictional scary story to give themselves a brief, highly entertaining thrill before safely drifting off to a peaceful sleep, completely secure in the undeniable belief that the physical world obeys logical, earthly rules. We inherently, unquestioningly trust that our locked doors keep the dangerous things outside, and we absolutely trust that the flat, silver-backed glass hanging on our walls is nothing more than a harmless, physical reflection of light. But when that supposedly unbreakable, fundamental law of reality is inexplicably and silently breached by something completely impossible, it rapidly transforms into a waking nightmare that permanently poisons your existence. I live entirely alone in a quiet, heavily isolated apartment building located in the dense, suburban outskirts of a sprawling city, working long, exhausting hours from home that often push my natural sleep schedule deep into the dead, silent hours of the early morning. It was a bitterly cold, completely windless Tuesday night in the absolute middle of October, and I was aimlessly scrolling through an obscure, largely forgotten online forum dedicated to strange, unverified urban legends and modern folklore. That was where I first read the chilling, highly detailed account of a dark, ancient phenomenon simply referred to by the anonymous users as the Mirror Bride. According to the deeply unsettling story, she is a highly predatory, completely unblinking entity that exclusively lives inside the cold, two-dimensional plane of reflective surfaces, silently traveling through the interconnected digital ether of mirrors, windows, and darkened screens. The legend claimed that she does not immediately attack or reveal her true, horrifying nature. Instead, she meticulously, patiently studies her chosen victim. From the other side of the glass. She looks exactly like you, down to the microscopic, biological imperfections of your skin. She moves exactly like you, perfectly mimicking the rhythmic, heavy sway of your posture. She smiles exactly like you, flawlessly capturing the exact, specific curvature of your lips. She remains completely, perfectly synchronized with your earthly body, acting exactly like a natural, harmless reflection, until the terrifying, inevitable moment when she simply decides that she no longer wants to. I remember letting out a long, exhausted, violently trembling sigh of pure, manufactured amusement, completely dismissing the bizarre narrative as nothing more than a well-written piece of internet nonsense designed to scare paranoid teenagers. I closed my laptop, the harsh, pale blue light completely vanishing from the dark living room, and slowly, meticulously walked down the short, pitch-black central hallway toward my bathroom to prepare for bed. At first, everything appeared completely, beautifully normal. I flipped the cold metal switch, and the harsh, sickly yellow fluorescent tubes mounted directly above the wide bathroom mirror violently flickered to life, aggressively illuminating the small, white-tiled room. I stood perfectly, rigidly still in front of the sink, running the cold tap water and lazily brushing my teeth, my deeply exhausted, bloodshot eyes staring blankly into my own reflection in the thick glass. But something felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally, and impossibly wrong about the exact, specific way the stagnant, freezing air suddenly felt actively pressing heavily against my exposed neck. I spat the white toothpaste into the ceramic basin, bent down to quickly rinse my face with the freezing water, and slowly, heavily stood back up to look at myself in the mirror. It was incredibly brief, a microscopic fraction of a single, highly pressurized second, but my exhausted brain clearly, undeniably registered that the pale, tired reflection staring back at me did not settle into its upright posture at the exact, identical moment my physical body did. It seemed to take an extra, highly unnatural millisecond to fully process my lack of motion, its dark, featureless silhouette subtly drifting upward just a few microscopic inches before abruptly, rigidly snapping perfectly back into its proper, static alignment. I stood completely frozen on the cold bathroom tiles, my frantically beating heart skipping a violent, agonizing beat before completely stalling in my tight, cramping chest. I desperately, pathetically tried to rationally explain the terrifying visual anomaly away using cold, hard, earthly logic. I forcefully convinced my rapidly fracturing mind that I was simply experiencing a severe, highly localized visual hallucination directly caused by my extreme sleep deprivation, the harsh, heavily distorted angle of the flickering overhead light, and the natural, heavy exhaustion weighing down my tired eyes. It was a completely harmless optical illusion, a visual lag caused by a tired brain misinterpreting sensory data in the quiet night. I turned off the light and practically sprinted back to my dark bedroom, desperately hoping that a long, peaceful night of undisturbed sleep would entirely reset my fragile, human perception. But the profound, creeping, ice-cold dread had already begun to pool heavily in the very bottom of my empty stomach, entirely paralyzing my ability to easily dismiss the encounter. Over the following, agonizing nights, the deeply unsettling, impossible delay actively began to become significantly, terrifyingly more noticeable, establishing a dark, highly methodical pattern that violently attacked my remaining sanity. I found myself becoming entirely, completely obsessed with aggressively checking my dark reflection in the bathroom mirror, my violently trembling head constantly, frantically snapping up to observe the glass whenever I walked into the room. The terrifying, impossible details slowly, methodically began to aggressively emerge from the flat, silver void, permanently destroying any remaining hope of a logical, earthly explanation. I noticed, with a sickening, freezing drop in my stomach, that my natural, biological blinking was beginning to feel profoundly, terrifyingly out of sync. I would stand perfectly, rigidly still in front of the cold glass, staring deeply into my own exhausted, dark eyes, and I would slowly, deliberately close my heavy eyelids. I would hold them shut for exactly 3 agonizing, heavily pressurized seconds, actively listening to the dead, static silence of the isolated apartment, and then I would rapidly, violently snap them open. For a terrifying, impossible fraction of a heartbeat, I could clearly see the pale eyelids of my reflection still completely closed, its blind, resting face actively exposed to my waking vision, before the mirror image smoothly, mechanically glided into the correct, open-eyed position. It felt exactly, terrifyingly as if the dark silhouette in the glass was not a passive, natural reflection of light, but a highly advanced, deeply paranormal, completely impossible physical entity actively processing and mimicking my biological actions on a terrifying, heavy delay. The movements felt entirely, fundamentally unnatural in the mirrors, completely lacking the smooth, fluid, biological grace of a living, breathing human being. When I would slowly, carefully raise my pale, trembling right hand to gently touch my cold cheek, the reflection would mirror the action with a deeply disturbing, robotic stiffness, its joints appearing to subtly, terrifyingly lock and snap into place, exactly like an ancient, archaic marionette being violently pulled by invisible strings. And the eye contact. That was the worst part. The profound, crushing psychological realization that the dark mirror was completely functioning as a clear, unblinking window into a highly predatory, overlapping dimension. When I casually glanced into the mirror to check my appearance, the reflection did not simply look back at me, it stared. It held the visual eye contact for entirely, impossibly too long. Even when I began to physically turn my heavy head away to look at the shower curtain or the closed door, I could violently, undeniably feel the intense, overwhelming, heavy gaze of the reflection continuing to actively, malevolently observe the side of my exposed face, entirely refusing to break the terrifying connection until the absolute last, microscopic possible second. The intense, overwhelming feeling of being intimately, malevolently watched completely saturated my fragile soul, an immense, crushing barometric pressure that violently anchored me to my own terrifying, absolute helplessness. As the agonizing, sleepless weeks slowly dragged on, the physical environment of my isolated bathroom began to violently react to the massive, highly unnatural presence actively occupying the reflective space. I noticed that the thick, heavy glass of the mirror felt incredibly, impossibly colder at night. During the bright, daylight hours, the surface of the mirror maintained a normal, earthly room temperature, but exactly after the sun set and the sprawling city was completely swallowed by the pitch-black darkness, the glass began to aggressively radiate a bitter, biting, freezing chill. If I hovered my violently trembling, bare hand just an inch away from the smooth surface, I could physically, undeniably feel a thick, heavy wave of toxic, freezing air actively bleeding out of the two-dimensional plane, smelling faintly and sickeningly of ancient, undisturbed dust and deep, rotting ice. The reflection seemed significantly, terrifyingly more active in the heavy darkness, actively manipulating the deep shadows pooling in the background of the mirrored room. I would stand in the dark bathroom, illuminated only by the pale, sickly moonlight aggressively bleeding through the small frosted window, and the dark silhouette of my reflection appeared to subtly, terrifyingly sway and vibrate, completely independent of my own rigid, statuesque posture. It was an ancient, unblinking watcher actively testing the boundaries of its silver cage, struggling to perfectly synchronize its massive, unseen presence with my own fragile, terrified life force. But the deeply sickening, impossible detail that completely, permanently shattered my reality was the smile. I was standing perfectly, rigidly still in the harsh, flickering fluorescent light, entirely consumed by a raw, screaming, animalistic paranoia, when I decided to forcefully test the limits of the dark anomaly. I stared deeply, intensely into the dark, exhausted eyes of my reflection, and I slowly, artificially forced the corners of my pale lips to turn upward into a wide, unnatural, highly exaggerated smile. I held the tense, uncomfortable expression, my facial muscles physically aching. The reflection mirrored the smile perfectly. But then, I abruptly, violently dropped the expression, returning my physical face to a completely flat, emotionless stare. I still can't explain it. The reflection did not drop the smile at the exact same moment. For a single, highly pressurized, terrifying millisecond, the pale figure in the glass continued to actively, widely smile at me, its dark, hollow eyes completely devoid of any earthly warmth, before the expression smoothly, mechanically melted away into a neutral stare. My reflection smiled a fraction too late, entirely revealing the deeply malicious, highly intelligent independence actively hiding behind the thin layer of silver paint. It was completely, undeniably thinking for itself. It would sometimes stare blankly, completely motionless, exactly as if it was actively deciding whether to copy my physical movement at all. I became entirely, completely obsessed with aggressively testing the impossible boundaries of the mirror, my frantically beating heart hammering a constant, heavy rhythm of pure primal dread. I spent endless, agonizing hours locked inside the small, freezing bathroom, moving incredibly slowly, executing highly sudden, chaotic, unpredictable physical movements, desperately trying to catch the dark entity completely off guard. I would stand perfectly, flawlessly still for 30 agonizing minutes, entirely holding my tight, cramping breath, completely terrified to cast a single shadow, just staring into the cold glass and waiting for the reflection to accidentally breathe. I needed undeniable, physical, digital evidence that the terrifying, impossible delay was actually, physically happening in the waking world, and not just entirely a product of my severe, deeply unbroken sleep deprivation. I desperately needed to physically prove to myself that I was not completely, hopelessly losing my mind. Late one freezing, completely windless Thursday night, I slowly, meticulously walked into the center of the brightly illuminated bathroom. I pulled my glowing smartphone entirely out of my heavy pocket, my clammy, violently sweating fingers gently resting exactly on the smooth glass screen. I carefully, methodically propped the digital camera perfectly upright against a heavy stack of folded towels resting on the wooden shelf directly beside the sink, angling the highly sensitive lens to perfectly, flawlessly capture both my own physical, standing body and the towering, pale reflection cast in the mirror directly in front of me. I pressed the bright red digital record button, the small, glowing timer silently ticking forward in the dead, heavy silence of the isolated room. I slowly stepped perfectly into the center of the illuminated frame. I stood perfectly, rigidly still for exactly 10 agonizing, heavily pressurized seconds, actively listening to the frantic, uneven hammering of my own trapped heartbeat. I stared deeply, intensely into the dark, unblinking eyes of the entity trapped in the glass. Then it happened again. I began to execute a series of highly deliberate, sharp, carefully measured physical movements. I slowly, aggressively raised my right arm entirely above my heavy head. I paused. I forcefully tilted my physical head completely to the left. I paused. And then, for the absolute final, terrifying test, I took a slow, deep, trembling breath of the freezing indoor air, stared directly into the camera lens reflected in the glass, and I slowly, deliberately formed a wide, highly exaggerated, deeply unnatural smile. I stopped abruptly, holding the awkward, tense posture for several long, suffocating seconds before completely relaxing my exhausted muscles and wiping the expression from my face. I slowly walked entirely out of the digital frame, my trembling hand reaching out to gently stop the video recording. The silence inside the apartment was deafening, a thick, stagnant void that completely lacked any natural, comforting background noise. I sat heavily down on the cold ceramic edge of the bathtub, the harsh, pale blue light from the glowing digital screen heavily illuminating my pale, sweating, completely terrified face. I opened the high-definition video file, my dry, burning eyes completely locked onto the small, bright rectangle. I played the recorded footage entirely through at completely normal, regular speed. At first, the video looked deeply weird but highly ambiguous. The pale reflection in the mirror definitely seemed slightly sluggish, highly unnatural, and deeply off-kilter, but the movement was so incredibly fast that it was practically impossible to definitively prove without a single shadow of a doubt. I needed to see the exact, microscopic mechanics of the impossible interaction. I paused the glowing video exactly at the absolute beginning of the final physical movement, the exact moment I had prepared to form the smile. I placed my violently trembling thumb directly onto the smooth digital slider at the bottom of the screen. I began to slowly, meticulously, and agonizingly scrub the recorded timeline forward, moving the high-definition footage exactly frame by single, highly pressurized frame. I watched the static image of my own physical, exhausted face staring perfectly blankly into the harsh light. I advanced the video one frame. Nothing. I advanced the video a second frame. Nothing. I advanced the video a third frame, completely preparing to watch my physical lips finally, slowly begin to curve upward, fully expecting to see the pale reflection in the mirror react a fraction of a second later, entirely confirming my terrifying theory of the delayed mimicry. But the terrifying, mind-breaking, absolute final impossibility aggressively revealed itself on the glowing screen, completely and permanently destroying the last clinging fragments of my human sanity. I stared deeply, helplessly into the flawless, high-definition digital playback, my tight, cramping lungs completely failing to draw a single, natural breath. As I slowly dragged the timeline forward, entirely focused on the exact moment of physical initiation, the horrifying truth violently shattered my reality. The pale, towering reflection cast in the thick glass absolutely did not smile after my physical body. As I advanced the timeline to the exact, microscopic frame right before my actual, physical facial muscles ever even twitched, the reflection in the video smoothly, deliberately, and highly mechanically began to stretch its pale lips into a wide, malicious grin. I sat perfectly, rigidly still in the freezing bathroom, staring blankly at the impossible, frozen image, completely realizing with a massive, soul-crushing dread that the dark entity was absolutely not lagging behind my actions. It was actively, patiently leading them, entirely pulling the invisible, heavy strings of my physical reality from the cold, silver void, and the digital recording undeniably proved that my reflection smiles before I do. The deeply unsettling realization that the person staring back at me from the cold glass was no longer strictly obeying the immutable laws of earthly physics completely shattered the fragile illusion of safety I had meticulously built within my own home. Living through a true horror story like this does not just frighten you in a fleeting, adrenaline-fueled rush, it slowly and methodically rewrites your baseline understanding of reality, leaving you trapped in a quiet, suffocating paranoia that infects every mundane aspect of your daily life. After that first night, when I noticed the microscopic, impossible delay in my bathroom mirror, my rational mind desperately tried to construct a logical defense. I blamed the profound sleep deprivation that had been plaguing me for weeks. I blamed the harsh, flickering fluorescent bulbs illuminating the small room. I even researched obscure psychological phenomena like the Troxler effect, desperately hoping that my tired brain was simply distorting my own facial features after staring at a fixed point for too long. But those comfortable, earthly explanations quickly began to deteriorate, completely failing to account for the terrifying reality actively unfolding inside my apartment. I became increasingly, deeply obsessed with the reflection. It was a dark, hypnotic compulsion that I could not fight. I would find myself wandering into the bathroom at 2 or 3 in the morning, standing perfectly still on the cold ceramic tiles, leaning my pale, sweating face mere inches from the silver-backed glass. I would stare intensely into my own dark, exhausted eyes, holding my breath in the stagnant, heavy indoor air, simply waiting for the anomaly to reveal itself again. And it always did. The behavior inside the mirrors slowly shifted from a subtle, questionable delay into an impossible, undeniable independence that became entirely impossible to ignore. Disturbing events began to escalate with a quiet, measured patience. I would slowly raise my right hand to brush my hair, and the reflection would casually mimic the action, but its movement felt strangely rehearsed, slightly too smooth, lacking the natural, subtle tremors of my exhausted muscles. Then, the reflection occasionally moved entirely independently. I would slowly lower my arm to my side, entirely dropping my physical posture, but the figure trapped inside the cold glass would hesitate. For a fraction of a single, highly pressurized second, its hand would remain hovering near its face before finally, mechanically snapping back into the correct mirrored position. But something felt wrong. It was not just the movement that was betraying the laws of physics, it was the emotional resonance of the image. Mirrors began to silently show subtle, disturbing expressions that I never actually made in the physical world. I would be standing there, feeling nothing but a hollow, crushing exhaustion, my facial muscles completely relaxed and drooping with fatigue. But the face staring back at me from the other side of the glass would look different. Its brow would be slightly furrowed. Its jaw would be tightly clenched. The reflection sometimes appeared deeply exhausted, yet underscored by a quiet, simmering, highly intelligent anger. It was actively feeling emotions that I did not possess. That was when I noticed it. The blinking. I stood in the dim hallway, staring into the tall, decorative mirror hanging near the front door. I deliberately, slowly closed my dry, burning eyes, completely intending to count to 3 before opening them. But the exact moment my physical eyelids shut, a deep, primal survival instinct screamed in the back of my mind. I snapped my eyes open instantly, entirely catching the reflection off guard. The eyes in the glass were still closed. They remained shut for a distinct, terrifying heartbeat before suddenly, rapidly fluttering open to match my stare. Reflections were actively blinking at completely different times. It was a horrific, undeniable confirmation that I was no longer looking at bounced light, but into a clear window where an unblinking watcher was actively trying to maintain a complex illusion. The physical environment around these reflective surfaces also began to warp and decay under the heavy, paranormal pressure. The reflective surfaces themselves seemed significantly darker than normal. The bright, silver clarity of the bathroom mirror slowly took on a deep, murky, almost oceanic quality, looking exactly like a stagnant pool of black water stretching endlessly into a dark void. I could not see the reflection of the shower curtain or the bathroom door behind me in the glass anymore. Those background details were completely swallowed by a dense, oppressive shadow that seemed to pool heavily around the figure of my imposter. Furthermore, the electrical wiring in my apartment began to violently react to the unnatural presence. The lights would constantly, rhythmically flicker near mirrors at night. Whenever I stood directly in front of the glass, the pale yellow bulbs would emit a low, vibrating hum, dimming significantly and aggressively, exactly as if the dark surface of the mirror was actively draining the energy from the room to sustain the impossible entity lurking just beneath the glass. The heavy, pressurized silence of the isolated apartment became completely deafening, a thick, static void that actively pushed me toward a complete psychological collapse. I could not handle the quiet isolation of this real experience any longer. I needed to know if I was losing my mind, or if there was an earthly precedent for this specific, creeping nightmare. Late one freezing Tuesday night, huddled safely on my living room couch with every single light turned on, I opened my laptop and began to frantically research the urban legend online. I scoured deeply buried digital archives, old paranormal message boards, and obscure folklore databases, desperately searching for any mention of reflections acting independently. After hours of scrolling through useless, fabricated ghost stories, I finally discovered a sparse, chilling thread that instantly froze the warm blood in my veins. It detailed a centuries-old, forgotten superstition, a dark myth simply referred to as the Mirror Bride. According to the deeply unsettling lore, the Mirror Bride is not a ghost, and it is not a demon. It is a supposed entity that exists entirely within the spaces between light and glass, an ancient parasite that survives by stealing the physical identities of the living. The text explicitly outlined its terrifying, methodical process. It does not attack its victims violently. It copies people slowly. The entity uses any reflective surface as an observation deck, silently watching its target for weeks or even months, meticulously learning their posture, their micro-expressions, and the exact cadence of their breathing. It studies human behavior with a cold, predatory patience, practicing the imitation until it is completely, flawlessly indistinguishable from the original host. The folklore warned that the entity feeds on attention, it waits for prolonged eye contact, using the fixed stare of the victim to build a bridge between the dark mirror dimension and the waking, earthly world. The final, horrifying rule of the legend was the most devastating. Once the entity has completely perfected the imitation and gathered enough energy from the prolonged observation, it eventually replaces the original person. The victim is silently pulled into the cold, dark, stagnant void behind the glass, while the entity seamlessly steps out into the physical world, adopting their life, their family, and their completely stolen existence. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands violently trembling, my chest heaving as I struggled to draw a single, natural breath. The story perfectly, terrifyingly matched every single impossible detail I had been experiencing. The delayed movements, the independent blinking, the subtle emotional shifts in the face. It wasn't just a glitch in reality, it was an active, highly intelligent predator practicing my existence. I was not going to let it finish learning. The next morning, fueled by a raw, desperate paranoia, I systematically moved through my entire apartment, actively destroying the entity's ability to observe me. I started avoiding mirrors entirely. I took a thick, heavy bath towel and draped it completely over the large bathroom mirror, securing the edges with strong duct tape so it could not accidentally slip. I took the tall, decorative mirror in the hallway and physically turned it around, pressing the reflective glass flat against the peeling plaster wall. I hid my small shaving mirror deep inside a dark drawer. I transformed my once comfortable home into a muted, dull sanctuary completely devoid of silver-backed glass, hoping that the lack of observation would sever the terrifying tether. For a few short, agonizing days, the heavy, toxic dread saturating the apartment seemed to slightly dissipate. But I quickly, sickeningly realized a fundamental flaw in my desperate plan. You cannot escape reflections in the modern world. Glass is everywhere, and the entity did not specifically need a silver-backed mirror to continue its silent, patient study. Reflections kept appearing in places I had completely failed to consider. The dark, empty windows of my apartment at night became massive, flawless observation decks. Because the ambient temperature outside had plummeted and the city was swallowed by a pitch-black winter darkness, the thick window panes acted exactly like perfect, dark mirrors. I would be walking past the kitchen window to get a glass of water, keeping my head heavily bowed, when out of the extreme, blurry edge of my peripheral vision, I would clearly see the pale, distinct shape of my reflection standing in the dark glass. It wasn't walking past the window like I was. It was standing perfectly still, its hands resting against the invisible barrier, silently watching my physical body move through the kitchen. The intrusion spread to my personal electronics. The black, glossy surface of my television screen became a source of constant, paralyzing dread. I would be sitting on the couch, the TV turned completely off, desperately trying to read a book in the dim light. But my burning eyes would inevitably drift toward the large, dark rectangle mounted on the wall. The dark television perfectly reflected the living room behind me. I would see my own slouched, exhausted posture reflected in the dark glass. But then it happened again. I would slowly, deliberately close my eyes to rest them, and when I opened them, the reflection in the dead television screen would have shifted. It would be sitting slightly differently, its head tilted at an impossible angle, just staring out into the physical room. Even my phone screen became an active threat. I would lock my smartphone, the screen fading to a smooth, black void, and for a fraction of a second, the dark reflection of my face staring back from the phone would not be looking down at the device. Its eyes would be looking directly up at me, possessing a cold, ancient awareness that completely bypassed the digital hardware. The psychological pressure slowly, methodically built into an unbearable, crushing weight. I was entirely isolated, too terrified to invite anyone over, too paranoid to step outside and catch my reflection in the dark windows of parked cars or the reflective glass of passing storefronts. I was trapped in a state of constant, exhausting vigilance, completely terrified to ever make accidental eye contact with any dark, polished surface. But one horrifying detail became abundantly, terrifyingly clear as the sleepless weeks dragged on. The reflection was slowly becoming more confident. It was no longer struggling to mimic my movements or accidentally lagging behind my actions. The awkward, hesitant delays had completely vanished. It was now deliberately, actively choosing to move differently, entirely flaunting its growing independence and its mastery over my physical form. I would stand in front of the dark window, my shoulders slumped with the heavy burden of pure exhaustion, my face pale and drawn. But the figure in the window would be standing perfectly straight, its broad shoulders pulled back, radiating a dominant, terrifying vitality that I had completely lost. It would look at me with a calm, patient, deeply unnerving smile, a smile I had absolutely never made, a smile that promised an inevitable, impending replacement. It knew that I knew. It knew that the fragile barrier of the glass was the only thing keeping it contained, and it completely understood that it was only a matter of time before the final, fatal connection was made. I started moving through my apartment with my eyes constantly fixed on the floorboards, entirely refusing to look up, completely refusing to engage with the dark surfaces surrounding me. The silence in the rooms was no longer empty, it felt incredibly crowded, heavily populated by the massive, unblinking presence actively waiting just millimeters away from my physical reality. The final escalation, the moment that permanently destroyed the last clinging fragments of my human sanity, occurred during the absolute dead of a freezing, windless night. I awoke abruptly at 3 o'clock in the morning, my throat completely dry, my bladder aching. The entire apartment was swallowed by a thick, heavy, pitch-black darkness. I slowly pushed myself out of my warm bed, my bare feet sinking into the cold hardwood floorboards. I kept my head heavily bowed, my tired eyes strictly locked onto the ground as I quietly navigated the dark hallway toward the bathroom. I did not want to turn on any overhead lights, entirely terrified that the sudden illumination would cast my reflection onto the dark window at the end of the corridor. I reached the open doorway of the bathroom. The room inside was pitch black, a deep, silent void. I knew exactly where the heavy towel was taped over the mirror above the sink. I knew that I was safe as long as the glass remained covered. I slowly reached my trembling hand inside the doorway, feeling along the cold plaster wall for the plastic light switch. I kept my gaze firmly planted on the white ceramic tiles of the bathroom floor, completely refusing to look up. But a faint, pale stream of ambient moonlight was aggressively bleeding through the small frosted window near the shower, casting a dim, sickly gray glow across the room. Out of the extreme, highly sensitive corner of my peripheral vision, I noticed something that instantly stopped my frantically beating heart dead in my tight, cramping chest. The heavy bath towel I had meticulously, securely taped over the mirror was no longer there. It had not simply fallen to the floor, the wall beneath the mirror was completely empty. The towel had been deliberately, cleanly removed. The large, silver-backed mirror was completely exposed in the dim, gray moonlight, acting exactly like a massive, dark, unblinking eye staring directly into the physical room. A massive, freezing shockwave of pure, unadulterated primal dread violently tore straight down my rigid spine. The air in the bathroom was incredibly cold, smelling faintly of old dust and stagnant water. I froze completely, my hand still hovering mere inches away from the light switch. I desperately, pathetically tried to convince my rapidly fracturing mind to just keep looking at the floor, to turn around, to walk entirely back to my bedroom and lock the heavy wooden door. But the heavy, hypnotic, deeply invasive compulsion actively radiating from the exposed glass forcefully commanded my terrified body to look. I slowly, agonizingly raised my heavy head. I looked directly into the dim, moonlit mirror. I had not moved into the center of the room. I had not stepped in front of the glass. I was still standing perfectly, rigidly still in the dark doorway, entirely hidden in the deep shadows. But the mirror was not empty. Standing perfectly visible in the center of the dark, reflective glass, completely bathed in the pale moonlight, was my exact physical double. It was not mimicking my hidden posture. It was standing tall, its hands resting calmly on the edges of the porcelain sink, its head tilted slightly downward. And my reflection was already looking at me before I turned on the light. The deeply sickening, mind-shattering realization that the impossible, cold entity trapped inside the glass was no longer simply copying my behavior fundamentally destroyed any remaining, fragile fragments of my human sanity. This is a true horror story about a completely silent, deeply predatory invasion that actively overwrites your foundational understanding of the physical world, violently forcing you to accept that your absolute safety is merely a pathetic, temporary illusion. Until that point, I had desperately, foolishly tried to rationalize the terrifying anomalies as a severe, localized visual hallucination directly caused by my extreme sleep deprivation, forcefully convincing my rapidly fracturing mind that my reflection was just lagging a fraction of a second behind my own physical movements. But living through a terrifying real experience permanently poisons your perception of waking reality, and the impossible truth aggressively revealed itself with a highly toxic, heavy barometric pressure that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my tight, cramping lungs. It was replacing me. The dark, unblinking silhouette was actively, methodically preparing to completely sever the ancient, natural tether that kept it anchored to the two-dimensional plane of light and glass. The disturbing events actively invading my safe sanctuary violently intensified over the following, agonizing days, completely bypassing the immutable laws of earthly physics. I would stand perfectly, rigidly still in front of the cold bathroom mirror, the harsh, sickly overhead fluorescent light aggressively illuminating my pale, heavily sweating face. I would slowly, deliberately decide to raise my right hand to brush my hair, but before my physical, biological muscles ever even twitched, the dark reflection in the mirror would smoothly, mechanically raise its own hand. The mirrors began to show my exact, specific movements a full, terrifying second before they actually, physically happened in the waking world. It felt exactly, terrifyingly as if the entity was actively, patiently leading my actions, entirely pulling the invisible, heavy strings of my physical reality from the dark, static void. But something felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally, and impossibly wrong about the exact way the reflection behaved when I was no longer directly observing it. That was when I noticed it. I would turn my heavy body around to slowly walk entirely out of the bathroom, and through the extreme, highly sensitive, blurry edges of my peripheral vision, I would clearly, undeniably see that the dark reflection did not turn around with me. The reflections continued moving. And acting entirely independently after I had physically left the frame, the dark silhouette remaining perfectly, statuesquely still, standing completely upright in the mirror and calmly, malevolently watching my exposed back as I retreated down the hallway. Even in the public, waking world, the deeply terrifying, impossible anomaly began to aggressively bleed into my mundane, daily life, actively corrupting my interactions with other human beings. Strangers and casual acquaintances began to constantly, nervously comment that I looked completely different. I would be standing in line at the local grocery store, completely exhausted and entirely consumed by a raw, screaming paranoia, and the cashier, a woman who had seen my face every single week for years, would hesitate as she handed me my receipt. Her brow would furrow in deep, unsettling confusion, her tired eyes nervously scanning my pale features before she quietly whispered that I seemed somehow changed, exactly as if my physical face was slowly, methodically losing its defining human warmth and slowly becoming a hollow, unyielding porcelain mask. They could subconsciously feel the massive, heavy, toxic energy actively radiating from my physical form, a deeply sickening confirmation that the entity was actively, aggressively siphoning my identity directly through the reflective ether. I still can't explain it. The profound, psychological dread violently spiked when my reflection occasionally, completely refused to mimic my physical posture at all. There were agonizing, heavily pressurized moments where I would forcefully smile or casually tilt my head, and the pale, featureless face staring intensely back at me from the cold glass would remain completely, perfectly blank, its hollow, bottomless, dark voids actively observing my vulnerability with a terrifying, absolute, heavy patience. The physical properties of the mirrors themselves began feeling fundamentally, impossibly wrong. At night, when the sprawling, isolated apartment was completely swallowed by a heavy, suffocating, pitch-black darkness, the mirrors seemed vastly deeper than normal. They transformed from flat, two-dimensional panes of reflective glass into long, highly unnatural, suffocating tunnels stretching endlessly into a freezing, forgotten, deeply shadowed dimension. I could physically, undeniably feel an intense, massive, freezing weight aggressively pressing against the interior surface of the glass, a profound barometric pressure that made the thin barrier seem to aggressively radiate pure, toxic cold. The intense, overwhelming feeling of being intimately, malevolently watched completely saturated my fragile soul, a massive, crushing weight that completely anchored my trembling body to a constant state of raw, animalistic fear. I slowly, meticulously became entirely, completely terrified of any and all reflective surfaces, actively transforming my once comfortable home into a heavily modified, matte-textured prison. The deep, heavy dread actively forced me to aggressively avoid even the smallest, most insignificant sources of physical reflection. Even tiny, mundane reflections became completely, psychologically unbearable. I completely stopped using my metal silverware, entirely terrified that the polished, highly reflective curve of a simple stainless steel spoon would catch a microscopic, distorted glimpse of her hollow, unblinking eyes staring directly back at me from the dark void. I meticulously taped thick, heavy cardboard completely over every single windowpane in the apartment, absolutely refusing to let the dark glass act as a mirror against the pale, sickly glow of the distant street lamps. I actively avoided walking outside after it rained, because the shallow, dark rain puddles heavily coating the concrete sidewalk suddenly looked exactly like massive, unblinking eyes entirely reflecting the gray sky and whatever towering, impossible entity was silently hovering directly above my head. The worst, most inescapable terror was my own dark smartphone screen. Whenever the digital display timed out and faded to absolute black, the smooth, dark glass perfectly reflected the heavily shadowed room directly behind my face, and I would constantly, frantically shove the device completely out of sight, entirely terrified of what patient, unblinking entity might be seamlessly emerging from the digital ether. I was entirely, completely trapped in a suffocating, deeply isolating paranoia, entirely unable to sleep, entirely unable to eat, entirely sustained only by the massive, toxic spikes of freezing adrenaline that violently flooded my system every single time the old apartment settled. Then it happened again. The ultimate, mind-shattering physical escalation violently occurred late one freezing, completely windless Thursday night, permanently turning this into a scary story that I will absolutely never escape. A severe, unprecedented winter storm had aggressively rolled through the city limits, bringing heavy, blinding, freezing rain and fierce, howling winds that violently battered the exterior brick walls of the old building. The ambient temperature rapidly plummeted, and the heavy, stagnant indoor air felt incredibly dense and highly pressurized. I was sitting perfectly, rigidly still in the absolute dead center of my living room, tightly wrapped in a heavy winter blanket, desperately trying to ignore the chaotic weather. Then, accompanied by a loud, mechanical, deafening pop from the overloaded street transformer down the block, the entire municipal power grid completely failed. The entire sprawling apartment was instantly, violently plunged into absolute, pitch-black, suffocating darkness. All the comforting, ambient background noise of the humming refrigerator and the rattling heaters died instantly, completely swallowed by the heavy, static void. The only sound left in the entire world was the frantic, uneven, terrified hammering of my own trapped heartbeat violently echoing in my sensitive inner eardrums. I completely stopped breathing, my pale lips clamped tightly shut, entirely paralyzed by the sudden, massive shift in the environment. I sat in the dead, freezing silence for several agonizing, heavily pressurized minutes, entirely waiting for my wide, burning eyes to slowly adjust to the profound absence of light. I slowly, agonizingly turned my heavy head toward the far wall of the living room, exactly where a large, decorative, antique mirror hung heavily against the peeling plaster. The deeply sickening, massive, heavy, toxic realization instantly and violently slammed directly into my chest exactly like a massive iron sledgehammer. One night during a power outage, the narrator sees his reflection clearly in complete darkness. That should be impossible. The immutable, unbreakable laws of earthly physics had completely, violently collapsed. In a room entirely devoid of any physical, earthly light source, the large pane of glass was perfectly, flawlessly illuminated. The entity standing inside the mirror was bathed in a pale, sickly, highly unnatural ambient glow that absolutely did not exist in my physical living room. It was exactly like looking through a clear glass window into a perfectly lit, sterile, freezing hospital corridor. And standing exactly in the absolute dead center of that impossible, illuminated dimension, staring intensely and directly at my physical body sitting in the dark, was my reflection. But it was absolutely not me anymore. The features were perfectly, mathematically identical to my own, but the underlying, biological human warmth had been completely, terrifyingly hollowed out, replaced by an ancient, heavy, predatory void. I stood up slowly from the couch, my violently shaking legs feeling exactly like heavy, unyielding solid stone, entirely unable to pull my terrified gaze away from the glass. The reflection smiled calmly. It was a slow, deeply unnatural, highly calculated smile that aggressively stretched the pale skin of its face far beyond the limits of normal human anatomy, revealing rows of perfectly white, unyielding teeth. And then, it slowly, methodically stepped closer from inside the mirror. The heavy, dark silhouette smoothly glided toward the physical boundary of the glass, its featureless, elongated hands slowly raising to press perfectly flat against the interior surface of the mirror. I could physically, undeniably hear the faint, dry, rhythmic scraping of its pale fingers sliding against the barrier, a sound so deeply unsettling that it instantly sent a massive shockwave of pure primal dread tearing straight down my rigid spine. My rapidly fracturing mind violently recalled the obscure, ancient folklore I had desperately researched weeks ago. During a frantic, sleep-deprived night, the terrifying, cryptic myth perfectly describing the impossible anomaly known only as the Mirror Bride. It was a dark, forgotten legend about an ancient, highly predatory entity that seamlessly trapped its victims by perfectly mirroring their exact physical lives, slowly draining their reality until the reflection completely overpowered the host. The final, chilling warning deeply buried in that archived text violently echoed in my exhausted brain. If she ever stops copying you, don't look away. I knew with absolute, mind-shattering certainty that the fragile, physical barrier of the glass was the only remaining defense mechanism I possessed, and it was entirely, fundamentally dependent on my unbroken, direct visual observation. The entity was actively, aggressively testing my massive, overwhelming physical exhaustion, patiently waiting for a single, microscopic moment of human weakness to completely shatter the boundary and fully enter my physical world. I kept my wide, burning, completely unblinking eyes perfectly, securely locked onto the pale, smiling face staring back at me from the impossible light. The psychological pressure was immense, an overwhelming, crushing barometric weight that actively tore my remaining sanity into tiny, irreparable shreds. I held my terrified stare for what felt like an agonizing, endless, heavily pressurized eternity, my dry eyes aggressively burning with a sharp, piercing pain, my tight lungs completely screaming for precious oxygen. The cold, sick smile on the reflection's face never wavered, a heavy, statuesque, highly predatory patience that completely understood it possessed all of eternity to wait. I desperately, pathetically wanted to scream, to violently shatter the glass with a heavy chair, but I was entirely, completely paralyzed in a waking, suffocating nightmare, entirely unable to move a single, violently aching muscle. But human biology is fundamentally, incredibly weak, entirely incapable of maintaining absolute, rigid perfection against an ancient, unblinking force. My heavily exhausted, sleep-deprived body was violently actively shutting down, my heavy eyelids aggressively fluttering against my desperate willpower. The freezing indoor air slowly, naturally forced a microscopic, involuntary spasm in my facial muscles. I finally gathered the absolute last, desperate shred of courage, or perhaps I simply, completely succumbed to the ultimate, fatal biological failure, and looked away from the mirror for one single, agonizing second. I forcefully squeezed my dry, burning eyes completely shut, letting out a massive, violently trembling gasp of the stale, freezing air. The silence in the apartment immediately became absolute, a thick, stagnant, deeply predatory void that actively swallowed the chaotic sound of the winter storm outside. I kept my eyes closed for just one heartbeat. Just one microscopic, entirely fatal fraction of a second. The heavy, toxic energy aggressively saturating the room suddenly spiked to an unbearable, terrifying degree, the ambient temperature violently plummeting as a massive, heavy, unseen weight actively shifted the physical barometric pressure of the living room. When I slowly, agonizingly forced my terrified eyes to open and looked completely back at the large, decorative frame, his reflection is gone. The mirror was completely, flawlessly empty, reverted entirely back to a flat, dark pane of normal glass completely reflecting the pitch-black, suffocating darkness of my physical apartment. The pale, sickly, impossible illumination had instantly vanished. There was absolutely nobody standing inside the cold ether. I let out a weak, pathetic, deeply exhausted whimper of pure terror, completely realizing that the empty glass was absolutely not a sign of salvation, but a terrifying, undeniable confirmation of an absolute, permanent breach. I stood perfectly, rigidly still in the freezing dark, entirely terrified to move, entirely terrified to draw a single, natural breath. And then, a profound, deeply unnatural, highly physical presence actively pressed directly against the exposed, fine hairs on the back of my trembling neck. It smelled strongly and sickeningly of ancient, freezing dust and old, polished silver. I could physically, undeniably feel the slow, rhythmic, bitter, biting chill of its static, heavy, unnatural breath gently brushing against my skin, a cold exhalation that absolutely did not belong to my own lungs. But someone is now standing behind him in the apartment. The massive, towering, completely silent entity had perfectly, seamlessly crossed the fragile threshold, entirely slipping into the physical, three-dimensional space of my isolated sanctuary the exact, microscopic instant I had broken the visual tether. I absolutely did not turn around. I completely, hopelessly understood that the true horror of my existence had reached its absolute, inescapable conclusion, entirely trapping me in a permanent, waking paranoia. I simply stood there in the dead, heavy silence, feeling the unblinking, hollow gaze of the impossible anomaly staring directly at the back of my head in the freezing dark. And the thing in the mirror was finally living my life instead of watching it.